Hello everyone, today we talk about the expansion and consolidation of the Carolingian Empire. Recently we began to talk a bit more in detail about the Carolingians, something that I had not done since I started Schwerpunkt actually, and I think it's interesting to insist on this point. So essentially today we're gonna draw in outline the major dynamics of expansion of the Frankish power under the Carolingian dynasty, both from a strategical point of view and also from a more strictly political point of view. We will deal in part also with the papal crowning of Charlemagne in the year 800, etc., and look at a whole how the Carolingians managed to strengthen their power, chiefly from the time of Pippin III and ending with Charlemagne. So really at the moment of major rise of the empire. So, as an essential microscopical evidence, we have to stress how the rise to power of the Carolingians corresponded to a revival in the Frankish military expansion. So this is the broader picture. We're not going to tell how it began, because this thing actually began in the second half of the 7th century, so relatively early, of Pippin from Heristal and his quite troubled life, as well as one of his successors. Telling the truth, also in here up to Pippin, the Carolingian power was kind of still expanding with difficulty. It was not necessarily something that had to break out in such an enormous fashion. It's mostly from, however, Charles Martel really, and then eventually Pippin, that continued his father campaigns, that at least continued to keep in shape the political and military system that his father had created, that this machine very progressively starts expanding and getting into motion. So the as we have said many times in other videos, and all you want to know about the Carolingian history I'm referring to now, it's you can find it in the Carolingian Europe playlist. So we have seen actually many times how the Carolingian expansion really owed a lot to the coordination with with the Roman Church at many levels. This was not something new for the Franks, that had enjoyed a quite privileged relation with the Church of Rome since a very early age, actually since the times of Clovis. Italy and Gaul had kind of grown apart over time. They also had developed very different political models. The same regions were quite diverse within, not just between each other, but also within their own same territories. But definitely this special bond between the Merovingians and later the Carolingians with the papacy was really important for the development of the same Frankish power in Gaul. The Franks were always very cooperative with the ecclesiastical elites. They basically blended together with them. The Saint Carolingians are probably the best example of that, as they descended both from these local Frankish counts of Austrasia and the daughter of the Bishop Arnulf of Metz. That in fact the Carolingians are better to be called, in a certain sense, the Pippinid-Arnulfings, at least in their origins, because of this heritage that they had. The relation with the Church of Rome, however, was mostly reinforced, definitely in Carolingian times. And as we see how Pippin III organized between 754 and 56, respectively, 2 military expeditions against the Longobards into Italy, during which the Franks defeated the Longobard king Aistulf and basically rendered back to the Roman Pope both the Exarchate and the Pentapolis. So these had been essentially the formerly Byzantine territories, the former Byzantine territories that stretch essentially in today's Italian regions of Romagna and the Marches. So these military expeditions against the Longobards were very, very important in European history for many reasons. First of all, because contrarily wise to what is commonly believed, the Franks and the Longobards were not really like cats and dogs. They were at that time, up to that time, they had remained in pretty positive relations. The Longobards had helped the Franks into Provence, clashing against the Muslim invasions under Liutprand, when Liutprand was a kingdom of Longobardy, and generally speaking, it was a great, let's say, partnership between the Frankish and Longobard royalty, for which some of these kings were let's say, theoretically adoptive sons of the other. It was a common practice actually in the Germanic world to send the son of a king to be, to be recognized as a man in the court of another power. Usually, this happened through the cutting of the guy's hair by the hands of the same king. So this was a great display of friendship actually between the Franks and the Longobards. On the broader picture, you can argue that the Franks were definitely the major power since the 6th century. I mean, even before naturally the Longobard kingdom existed. And that they had also fought back in the day, especially in the second half of the 6th century, together with the Byzantines against the Longobards. I haven't talked about this in detail. I will surely in the future. But after that, and after the disgregation of the Merovingian power, definitely there was not a great enmity between the Franks and the Longobards. There were certain buffer states like Bavaria, essentially, that was contested between the Franks and the Longobards. Actually, the Longobards were probably Bavaria preferred to side with the Longobards because the Franks were seen as the bigger threat, even though the same Bavarians fought to lose eventually against the Longobards to control certain Alpine passes back in in today's in today's Austria and northern Italy. So there was this kind of balance of power that kind of had ideally put the Franks against the Longobards, because it was a natural route of expansion. I mean, from Gaul, the one into Italy. But up to this point, there were actually no reasons, no attritions of sorts that had essentially that could bring the Franks and the Longobards to clash together. You can argue that it was really the papacy that brought this conflict to start. The Franks were, by the way, very they had a great admiration and respect towards the Longobards, probably because the Longobards were the embodiments of this older Germanic, uncompromising Germanic identity that had never given up, not even having sedentarized now into Italy and objectively getting Romanized, but always remaining very Germanic in political culture, in traditions, in law. Whereas the Carolingians, I mean, just like the Merovingians had founded essentially, especially the Merovingians. Now the Carolingians were already fully into this system to get let's say to get Romanized also from a political point of view, feeling this imperial dignity that was somehow inherited by the Franks from from Rome in a way or in another, so nothing really new given what the events would have developed like. The Merovingians had always had in mind this thing, that basically they were in Gaul at best on behalf of the Romans, and that they were fully cooperative with the Roman Empire as by tradition. Obviously also the Franks had clashed back in the day against Rome, but the Merovingians even before actually entering to Gaul had been traditionally allies of the Romans, and when they entered into Gaul, they immediately understood that at least not immediately really, but this was thanks to Clovis, that in order to cooperate in Gaul, to create in Gaul the huge power they eventually managed to build up, they necessarily needed to be extremely tolerant and cooperative with the local Roman senatorial, Gallo-Roman elite, let's say. Gallo-Roman senatorial elite. This had brought to many transformations into the into the Frankish mindset that eventually was inherited by the Carolingians. Now it's very difficult to synthesize, to repeat this in a nutshell. I can just address you to certain videos I made. The one was Clovis. The one about Clovis you can find into I'll give you the title. One is called "The Franks and Clovis from Germany to Empire," that tells it in a relatively complete way, at least for what concerns the Merovingians. Then I made another video that takes into account, let me see here, yeah, there is emergence of the Western Empire, balance between Franks, Byzantines and Islam, Auctoritas and Potestas at the roots of the Renovatio Imperii. There is something in general I've been discussing about the Franks and their expansionism that makes you understand the ideal legacy of the Roman Empire the Franks thought to have collected, essentially. So I'm not gonna repeat it in practice now, as I'm just explaining what happened with the Longobards. Let's say that the Franks respected the Longobards highly, and at this point there was no attrition. The Longobards, however, were expanding into Italy. It was one of the few Romano-Germanic kingdoms, and basically, I think the only one that didn't collapse as a system, at least not up to the Carolingian conquest. So the one that actually the only one who was able to renew itself and to expand into something great. Also, the Anglo-Saxons were doing that. It took more time, actually, but they also had that kind of history, whereas, for instance, the Visigoths kind of imploded at a certain point on their own. The same Merovingians had basically destroyed the Frankish Empire, or at least they had vanished as a unitary power, and that's why the Carolingians come back and on very difficult premises kind of reshape the empire, but they also crumble in turn. The Longobards bit by bit had been able basically to bring almost all the Italian peninsula under their control. The main problem had been historically the Byzantine presence that wasn't, especially after the second half of the 6th century, much of a match. Actually, the Longobards were after that moment were always on the offensive, and they succeeded in eroding all of the Byzantine territory. The only one which was resisting was Rome. Rome was, even at the time, still a big city. It was difficult to seize, and especially the Longobards. Also in here, they're stereotypically pictured as kind of Arians in tone. At this time, they were fully Catholic. There was a strong pro-Longobard faction within Rome itself, so there were like half of the Roman aristocracy sided for the Longobards, and they even had their own pope. Unfortunately for the Longobards, the other faction elected the popes that eventually would would ask the Franks for support. But as we have seen before, especially after the fall of the Exarchate, So these and the Pentapolises were these the core of the Exarchate was basically the main Byzantine district existing into Italy in the north. It was a pretty Romanized area, and the Longobards had managed now to seize it as it had gone declining as let's say as a decentralized Byzantine presence, as Byzantine Italy actually had grown pretty similar to the Longobard one over time. And this Pentapolis, there were these 5 cities in the marches on the Adriatic Sea. So that was a very important conquest for the Longobards, because now they could threaten Rome more directly, so beginning to surround it essentially, because there was basically at that point no other power between the Po Valley and the southern Longobard duchies. And the Longobard monarchy was expanding, in fact, its power over these southern duchies that had been quite autonomous at that point, and also it was allowing the Longobards to strengthen their presence into the Adriatic Sea. That up to that point, telling the truth, hadn't been much of a route of expansion, as the Longobards had a very few maritime power, and the most they had was in the Tyrrhenian Sea, essentially, in the Ligurian Tyrrhenian Sea. So Rome, now it was just a matter of time before Rome would crumble, and the Longobards would have simply maintained the Pope in Rome once the city had fallen, and simply, I don't know, maybe making the papacy supporting them, just like eventually it happened between the papacy and the Franks. But so it didn't go, and the popes, now, traditionally the papacy had always looked at the east, at the Byzantine Empire, for help against the Longobards, even though sometimes the same pope had allied himself against together with the Longobards against these local Byzantine powers into the Italian peninsula to hold their ambitions, because theoretically the Byzantines always wanted to bring the Roman Pope under their full control, like it happened in the Constantinopolitan Church, whereas the popes always said not. And you can argue that great part of the Italian Middle Ages has been about this. I mean, the papacy always calling up someone to help him get him rid from this X power that wanted to basically subjugate its the pontifical powers to their ends. Excuse me, I drink a little bit once again. So at this point, the Pope was practically was acknowledging that the Byzantines couldn't really intervene into Italian affairs anymore, as in fact the Longobards were now the major power. Definitely Constantinople had not the force nor the interest at this point to go calm this lodge. It would have been impossible, if not after generations of continuous warfare. But where would Constantinople found the resources at this point, while they were so much busy with other threats along the eastern frontier and other populations, so in the Balkans now eventually. So it wasn't feasible. So this is this great historical moment into which the papacy starts looking back more directly at the Franks and saying, okay, let's choose these to prevent Rome being seized by the Longobards. And the popes were clever because they perfectly knew. I mean, as we were saying, Rome was a big city. It had a powerful aristocracy. It was in the center of Italy, so far from the core of the Frankish powers. They were perfectly aware the Franks couldn't directly interfere into the papal matters more than much, at least given the overall instability of the Frankish system, as it was known. So the popes were perfectly aware that if the Franks had wiped out the Longobards, they would have represented a much less interferent problem for papal autonomy. And in any case, the Byzantines could still be called to back the papacy and to being invited in this sense in the wall, especially into southern Italy, where eventually the Byzantines would start to re-expand, but definitely all in a very changed situation. In fact, when the Longobard kingdom was destroyed by the Franks, and the Franks could control essentially only northern and central Italy, while the southern part of the peninsula could be accessed relatively easily by the Byzantines. Although there were also the Longobard principalities of the south that survived. I made a video about those if you're interested. I have even a Longobard playlist, a Longobard history playlist about the southern Longobards. It's less, yeah. This is the title of the video: the southern Longobards, Langobardia Minor. So if you want to know more about Longobards, they're actually an extremely fascinating topic and an extremely overlooked topic of early medieval history. So to make the long story short, the Franks realized that, first of all, the papacy had offered in exchange for their military intervention into Italy a recognition of their power, of their full power, by the way, because there had been this problem that the Carolingians had not been legitimized as true rulers of the Frankish Empire. They had been partially usurping the throne de facto. Then they, as the Merovingian dynasty was a dynasty, as a matter of fact, it was really a matter of blood. It wasn't just so the Pope basically granted the Franks the title of kings of the Franks proper. So allowing this switch and having many privileges deriving from this, and the Franks were the Carolingians were at this point extremely sensitive to this, because they realized that a moral, let's say a sanction of their moral, of their power from such an important authority like the papacy would have dramatically strengthened their legitimacy as rulers and could really bring to many interesting developments, which is actually how it happened. So at this time, the Franks were really not trying to destroy the Longobards, because they were, as we've seen, they were in friendly relation with them. Nevertheless, at this point, Pippin had demanded the Longobards to stop the harassment on Rome, stopping the incursions the pressure was imposed, and to give back to the papacy these territories. So at this point, the Longobard king Haistulf was an extremely capable sovereign, but there was not much that the Longobards could do against the Carolingian military machine. I mean, even if the Longobards had been just like equal to the Franks in arms, which is not something we have to necessarily underestimate, but they were still like a tiny thing compared to the whole Carolingian Empire by the size it had achieved, it had reached at this time. So it was really a matter of a midget fighting against a giant, and the Longobards actually tried to hold the Frankish invasion of the Po Valley by waiting for the Frankish army and at the end of the Alpine valleys and making a blockade. But nevertheless, the Franks were able to defeat them equally, and the Longobards were. We don't really know how they were defeated. We know that the King Haistulf really even at the first time I think it charged against the Franks, so trying to prove this typically Germanic fashion, the idea that they were fighting in equal ways. I think the other time there was a passage that allowed the Franks to go past the Longobard blockade. To make the long story short, the Longobards were defeated twice. But they didn't give up, and Haistulf actually would have even prepared for a third invasion, but he eventually died in a hunting accident. And after that, political matters in Longobard Kingdom stopped going very, very well. Also because the Franks had proven that they could now penetrate into Italy twice to defeat the Longobard army, and so the world system was kind of collapsing. We know that there were many Longobards now were fleeing into the Frankish Empire as well to avoid eventually the devastations of the looming disaster was seemingly about to happen into Italy at that point. The important thing is, however, Pippin was light-handed actually on the Longobards, because he understood the intrinsic illegitimacy of such an invasion. The Franks had been called by the Pope, but there was really nothing wrong the Longobards had done against the Franks, and this is something that also. By the way, the Franks had many other problems now. That they didn't have just the Longobards, as the Longobards in fact were peaceful with them, so they had to deal with many other rebellious populations all over the empire, were much more of a problem for them. So this is also partly why they didn't go hard on them. But in the second invasion, after second defeat of the Longobards, Pippin was a bit harsher, as at that point there had been agreements that had been violated by Longobards who had tried to recover essentially let's say the status quo ante, and they at that point it was becoming sort of a personal matter, because they weren't just doing something wrong against the papacy. Now they were essentially disrespecting the agreements that the Carolingians had imposed on them. So the Longobards really felt very much their own spirit of independence, and they couldn't submit to this, withstand this imposition. But it was evident that also into the Longobard kingdom there was something that started working bad, and to go bad quite seriously, let's say. This Frankish intervention couldn't be halted. This showed the Franks how relatively easy it was to invade Italy, and the whole system got really shattered from the foundations. So, however, under Pippin there were no other military expeditions against the Longobards. On the contrary, the Carolingians at this point attempted to consolidate the Frankish presence into southern Gaul. Southern Gaul had remained, historically speaking, detached from the Frankish north. The Frankish kingdom proper was the one in this region of Francia, of Neustria and Austrasia, essentially north of the Loire river, and whereas Aquitaine and Provence had remained substantially detached from the Frankish dominion, or at least they were controlled in a quite decentralized fashion, especially during the decline of the Merovingians. These were areas that had developed kind of very large autonomies on their own. Plus, there was also a bit of obviously of different identity, as southern Gaul was Occitan, you can say, was much more urbanized and Romanized region of Gaul than the north. It was projected on the Mediterranean. It also had relations with Italy, with Spain. They had actually lots of things in common also with these countries, and they had tried to maintain their kind of independence, especially the Aquitanian. I mean, the Provence and the Rhone Valley, I mean, that area was a bit more fragmented. There was no real, let's say, structured political power in there. Those were, in origin, the Burgundian lands, but so the Burgundian power had declined, and I made a video about the Burgundians in migration era playlist if you're interested what their story had been. The ones that troubled the most the Carolingians were the Aquitanians, because the Aquitanians had always been, they had enough agricultural resources. They were also here pretty jealous of their autonomy. They never mingled very pleasantly with the Franks, so they kept rebelling, and the Carolingians had to subdue them with several military expeditions. That was a very important area to control, as we will see it eventually, also because it was the key of access for the Pyrenees, and now with the Franks had been dealing also with the Arab invasions from there, so it was very important to secure southern Gaul in order to control, in order to open a way also into the Mediterranean that up to that point had been prevented by the events, because the Merovingians had crumbled. Now the Carolingians were trying to re-expand the empire. The Byzantines were a bit out of reach. In fact, that video I advised you before, emergence of the Western Empire, balance between Franks, Byzantines, and Islam, deals exactly with this. I mean, it talks about how the Carolingians basically managed to expand the Frankish dominion on the direction that they had to abort into the 6th century because of the let's say of the general crisis of the Merovingian kingdom, the invasion of Italy, the Longobard invasion of Italy, and still, the presence of the Byzantines in the area. Now, this southern frontier was much softer, and the Carolingians were now a growing power, so they were heading towards that direction. And naturally it was very important, especially controlling the Rhone Valley was an extremely remunerative enterprise, because all the Rhone Valley is like the channel that from the Mediterranean brings the goods into Central Europe, and controlling it is quite easy if you you're able to invade the region and capture the main strongholds. So that's what the Carolingians looked at. Albeit we should say that of course the Carolingians have these kind of parabola of their power that managed to bring certain territories under their control by this end of especially of the say second half of the 8th, first half of the 9th century. But these were areas that were grown to grow autonomous eventually once again. The southern Gauls, in Provence especially, they even preferred to have Muslim lordships all around than a powerful Frankish empire telling them what to do. And that's part of the reason why the Saracen presence in southern France remained for such a long time. Not much because of the strength of the Saracens, but because the local authorities were, kind of better off with them, in spite of all the raids and all, than having a guy who ruled there with iron fist. And they also had their profits with the Muslims as well. So that's also a quite interesting area to study, especially in the 10th century, from say the 9th to the 11th century more than else. Very important campaigns were launched for the first time, well, not really for the first time, but more consistently by Pippin on let's say east of the river Rhine. So these were aimed essentially at controlling this area of Germany that had always kind of gravitated around the Frankish Empire, but never had been subdued. Also because of environmental problems, because these were very wild territories. They kind of were very superficially had been very superficially Romanized. They had not been deforested, how you say that, or there was no reclamation. I mean, the terrain was quite difficult to do. The Merovingians had carried out some colonization of central and southern Germany back in the day, in the 6th century, and they had kind of made a headway in there. So Germany was not fully aware, but especially the north of Germany had remained basically untouched by the Frankish domination directly, albeit they were quite similar to the Franks themselves, especially the Austrasians. The same Carolingians emerged originally from this very tormented eastern frontier of the empire that was in fact the one with the Saxons that kind of launched raids into Frankish territory, and then the Frankish counts went there repressing them. So the military average on that frontier was usually higher, and that's also what contributed to the rise of the Carolingians, because they were very capable and experienced leaders, military leaders in the area. So these areas were also populated by other communities that more or less were all akin also to the Saxons, and beyond the Elbe River there were also the Slavs that were actually first engaged by the Carolingians into the clash against the Saxons, and then eventually, when Saxony was conquered, became instead the enemies. They became the new frontier of the empire, the Saxons were this kind of thorn on the side of the Franks forever, until Saxony was eventually subdued by Charlemagne. And we will talk a bit more about that later when starting to talk about Charlemagne, which we immediately start to do because Pippin III died in 768. Naturally, there were many other offenses and many other invasions that were, that were especially aimed at repressing populations that already kind of were framed within the empire. The Frisians, for instance, were this kind of troublesome presence. There were the populations of Brittany that were also pretty warlike, and generally speaking, here and there, there were the Aquitanians naturally, but also other rebel aristocracies scattered all over the empire that were to be subjugated. And you can argue that the Carolingian military machine basically took shape in this process. If you wonder why also recently we talked about a bit about this in the video I made on the Carolingian army organization. So if you're interested, why the Carolingians began to put much more emphasis on cavalry, and why they started developing this professional mounted elite with the Vassalatic-Beneficiary system and all. Well, because this was the most practical way to given the political and social premises of the Frankish Empire, to provide to the royal power a replenishment of troops, of cavalrymen that could be deployed quite fast, basically all over the territory of the empire. And in this let's say, forever ongoing warfare that therefore made it necessary to create a professional army, not just a seasonal army that was terribly difficult to put into motion, the old classical levy of freemen, etc. Also in here, the Carolingians didn't probably invent anything new, because these military retinues and clienteles already existed before. It's just that the Carolingians kind of make this system practically universal all over the empire. They develop a lot this system, and they start providing their clients with ever larger amount of land. Also confiscating the lands of those who had usurped them during the disgregation of the Carolingian, of the Merovingian Empire. Actually, this thing seemingly had started, especially under Charles Martel, that in fact when expanding, especially in southern France and other areas, began to confiscate a lot of lands that belonged to the local bishops. Bishops were extremely powerful and warlike in Frankish Gaul, and part of these clergymen had basically seized a lot of territories that in origin pertained to the royal power, to the Merovingian dynasty, that now were retaken by the Carolingians. So you don't have to imagine the ugly and evil Carolingian knights that arrive and deprive the poor little country priest of his tiny land. No, these were extremely powerful aristocrats, extremely powerful clergymen that had their own military retinues, that made an active resistance to that. They had a huge ambition, and in fact, Charles Martel especially suffered a very bad press, historiographically speaking, because the church was extremely disaffectioned with his measures, at least the Gallic church, and wrote many wrong things about it. But this was also through these ecclesiastical estates that the Carolingians made it to create their own military elite and to become essentially the leading power into Western Europe. So at this time, under Pippin, under Charlemagne, the system was fully functional, and these military expeditions took place every single year, because there was always someone to fight, either on the frontiers, either within it, either beyond the frontiers as well. This was, as we've seen, a moment of expansionism. So the function develops the organ. So essentially, this military system was getting perfectly shaped, kept fit, and extended. Also, because expanding into territories that weren't on new territories naturally equated to have new land. So naturally this system was rigged, and you can argue that the same fall of the Carolingian Empire was caused by the same fact that the Carolingians had entrusted so much people, so much land, that in the absence of a further, more centralized structure that the Carolingians basically never achieved to build, if not in very weak ways, this at the end of the expansion, when the empire was overstretched, this thing would have basically collapsed, because these various Carolingian counts would have simply remained where they were and create private lordships, and that's how, in a nutshell, the Carolingian Empire finished. The most important thing was, though, that this system was standardized in practice into Western Europe, and it's where the one from which Frankish feudalism would emerge and would shape the history of Europe and the world as we know it, all through this process. So when Pippin III died in 768, there was a moment of stalemate into the Carolingian expansion for the old question of the problem the Franks split it at every single generation the territory of the empire among the male sons. So this was a Germanic tradition that existed also naturally within the commoners, let's say, not just into the royalty, but that posed many problems because basically every Carolingian son wanted his share. This was the point. It was considered an insult to have received less than his brother, and so on. Naturally, here certain patrimonial strategies were attempted also to preserve a bit the unity of the empire, but as in this case, with the sons of Pippin, Charles, eventually the one who would become Charlemagne, and Carloman was his, if I'm not wrong, half brother. They began immediately. They got essentially two equal parts of the empire, and they naturally began to entering in attrition, which was normal. It was the same reason for which the Merovingian Empire had collapsed, because the Merovingians at each generation split their kingdom or empire, depending on how you want to put the frontier, into as many sons there were. By the end of the 7th century, there was no Merovingian Empire, whereas essentially there were 4 small kingdoms that all pursued their own opportunistic politics, always kind of, however, sticking together, because what is interesting in this process is that it's evidence also with the rise of the Carolingians, is that in spite of this division, the core idea that there is a Frankish center of power that kind of rules on the other populations, subjugated populations all around, always remained there, because it was too convenient to be forgotten or to fall out of practice. These smaller kingdoms had been kind of powerful on their own, because they were all more or less concentrated into this area of northeastern France. They were all bordering the one with each other, were very important dioceses, so very important also centers of power in this extremely fertile land of Europe. So this is how the Merovingian empire structure kind of was inherited by the Carolingians, because it still existed in part as a concept. So the Carolingians, as masters of palace, basically wiped out the masters of palace of all these other smaller powers, and they rose to as overlords of the whole Merovingian lands, and eventually inherited them de facto as also as Frankish kings when the Pope granted to them that title and the Merovingian dynasty died out with Chilperic III, if I'm not wrong. That wasn't even a Merovingian. I mean, seemingly his origins were actually very obscure. Very importantly, the Carolingians also inherited this dynastic conception of the Merovingians. No other Germanic power at the time had developed so strongly the ideal of the dynastic ideal as the Franks. There was nothing like this in other countries. There were naturally fathers, sons succeeding to their father to power, but the political situation was first of all very much more fragmented. Think about Anglo-Saxon England, or the aristocracies were more powerful, like in Visigothic Spain, that now had already fallen to the Arabs, or there were elective monarchies, like into the Longobarд kingdom, that strangely functioned in that case. But the Franks were the only ones who said, okay, this is not just the empire of the Franks as a people. This is the land of the Franks as essentially the patrimony of the Merovingian dynasty, the personal patrimony of the Merovingian dynasty. This was the eternal struggle, essentially, in the Germanic world between the freeman's ideal and the effort of centralization of the elites that had to find some way to impose their authority on a world that otherwise was completely refusing that kind of centralistic model by Germanic tradition. The Franks had succeeded in this also because Gaul was extremely wealthy, was extremely stratified socially speaking. In other countries it wasn't like that. For instance, also Italy was extremely wealthy, but the property was distributed in quite different way, for which the middle class was much better well off. But this was this, for instance, produced the weakness of the Longobards in Italy, because they had this kind of flourishing economy. They had a lot of trade, they had a lot of also literacy for the time standards and so on, but they didn't have professional military retinues because there weren't lords like the one that existed in Gaul. Even the average Frankish noble had more lands, more private lands than the Longobard king in himself. So it was difficult for the Longobards to create a professional class of fighters, because their society was not stratified at the point of having tons of people working for a single one to go to war equipped every single year on horseback as a heavy cavalryman, like instead it happened in Francia. So actually Gaul was even richer than Italy probably at this time in sheer amount of wealth, but this enormous wealth was concentrated in the hands of a very few people, and the Carolingians basically accelerated this process, and that's how feudalism was born, because this mounted elite had to be essentially was affordable only through the work of lots of people who were essentially forced to produce the necessary amount of resources for this person to equip, to train all his life, to fight on horseback. So the costs were enormous, but this allowed the Carolingians to afford this extremely functional, professional, mounted elite, with which they conquered literally half of Europe. And this is really the core concept. If you understand this, you have understood half of medieval history. So the this thing of Charles and Carloman is very, very important, because at this time, I mean, the Carolingian Empire as we know it now might have not existed. I mean, let's take if this Charles and Carloman had kept fighting the one against the other, or if one of the two sides had not prevailed, or if Charlemagne had died. Instead, it was Carloman that died. He was also weaker. He was seemingly, if I'm not wrong, he was lame or something, I don't know. Nevertheless, he had been this power that for a certain time halted the Franks, prevented the Franks from further expansion. The Longobards at this time also took kind of a new breath, and they were siding according to the convenience either Charlemagne or Carloman, trying to maintain his balance unaltered. Eventually Carloman dies in 771, and this allowed Charlemagne to take direct control of the whole kingdom. So when I say kingdom, because sometimes I say kingdom, sometimes empire, when I'm saying kingdom, I'm referring to the Regnum Francorum, so the kingdom of the Franks proper, the traditional core of Francia. we have seen it into this area of northern France, Benelux, and northwestern Germany. Then the empire of the Franks encompassed instead all these other lands that included the lands of the Aquitanians, the Burgundians, the Alemanni, later the Saxons, the Longobards, etc. So this is the concept. So from this time, Charlemagne reorganizes the kingdom and starts launching these massive campaigns all over Europe, sometimes I'd say often characterized by extreme violence, by the way, because the means of repressions were, quite they're actually quite the same all over history, but you have to think that sometimes, especially in this historical period of there was a great difficulty in controlling certain populations, so at the point that if they bothered you excessively, it was better to slaughter them. Although we must say that as violent as that world could be, the idea of a bloodshed was still very much, something quite serious. It was never done for sheer evil or for pure sadism, or there was always a quite calculated political reason for that. And you see that with the Saxons also in here. By the way, the sources are not always very clear. Sometimes certain baths of blood that are described by the sources probably didn't really happen, but this is just to prove that even sometimes certain certain confined episodes of violence were inflated more to say, okay, maybe by the same Carolingians, to show, look at what is going to happen if you don't obey, if you rebel. And the Franks were not tender souls. They were quite simple people. They saw a rebel, they slaughtered them. So it's they had very clear how to do this, and they were able to do it pretty effectively, as we see it. I would like to talk more about this in another video, especially I will surely make about how after all the Carolingians managed to maintain his empire. I mean, it kind of more it imploded in itself at the end, but it's not that there were massive invasions eventually. Even the second invasions were mostly something like raids and so on, but the general pattern that the Franks had given to society was kind of stable, and this is witnessed by the fact that Frankish feudalism eventually survived the same Carolingians and as a political and social model, and it would become the base on which Europe would expand into the later centuries. So there was never another people who, set foot in there and kind of began to rule over the system. Europe managed to make it alone from this time onwards. Naturally, they had to thank also the Byzantines for having stopped so many invasions from the steppes, from the Muslims. But aside from the fact that also the Franks fought to halt that, but there is no comparison between what the Byzantines had to halt from the east and what the Franks did. But when you look at the Carolingians' military accomplishments, you see they actually were surely capable. They surely knew what to do, what their job was about, and they knew how to carry that out very well. And it couldn't be so because the Franks, by tradition at this point, were all about war. As we have seen, this profession, especially the professionalism of their military, was something unprecedented in the Germanic world, in Latin Germanic Europe. It was something that, obviously, of course, the Roman Empire had it, but in this early medieval times, the Romano-Germanic kingdoms had, as we were saying before, kind of eventually vanished. They hadn't made it to establish this system This and this naturally was achieved also thanks to the nature, in fact, of Gaul, and what we were saying about before. I mean, this already present this land organized in large estates since the ancient times, as Gaul had not substantially underwent massive destructions from ancient times, like I don't know what had it had happened into Italy, or so these huge estates were transformed into early medieval times to provide these military retinues. So Frankish society had arguably already shaped itself as a military society or militarized society thanks to this system. And naturally, you have to understand also about the sheer amount of resources. I mean, Gaul being extremely fertile, having this huge agricultural surplus for those time standards, so they had the resources to carry out certain campaigns. It's not that the others were stupid and weren't like the Franks, or were worse fighters than like the Franks, or they had a less, warlike nature than the Franks. At this time, everybody had more or less the same warlike nature. The problem was also to have the resources to mount up expeditions of sending thousands of fighters across Europe for thousands of kilometers, fighting for months or even years, every year. So this is something you can't do in every single place of Europe at the time. The Saxons couldn't do that, the Longobards couldn't do that, only the Franks, because they were in this extremely fertile area of the Atlantic plains between, the stretching from the Pyrenees to Denmark, that had put in their hands the men and material, because also from a demic point of view, Gaul was in this sense able of providing numbers of recruits and so on. But mostly it was the elite that the Franks put into action. So a huge logistical ability, by the way, because this is also what probably characterizes the most the Frankish military, even before then the elite, because the elite took also considerable time in order to be built. A Frankish knight at this time was not something conceptually much different from a Longbard knight, for instance, but it was really the sheer amount of resources that could be provided for that knight to fight that really made the difference over time. And Charlemagne had a huge logistical talent. He was not a military genius, indeed, also because aside from, we know very few about Carolingian military history, because the only documented the only battle in which we can trace the actual dynamics is the Battle of Zuntal, the other of which was a Frankish defeat, by the way, against the Saxons. From all the other military operations, we have pretty sketchy outlines, and we don't know. I mean, this was a world into which extreme tactical sophistications were not there, so it was not a matter of being. We don't even have the historical evidence for saying, oh, this was a military genius or wasn't. But definitely, if you look at the campaigns into Bavaria or into Italy that Charlemagne was able to put up, those were something extraordinary, incredible, really, at the time. And at Carolingians at this point were just continuing to fight. Nothing else, from generation to generation. Charlemagne, following the example of his father, resumed the military expansion outside the traditional Regnum Francorum, in fact, and from especially, arguably, the most important achievement of the Carolingians, that basically they the major feat, endeavor that they achieved was the conquest of Saxony. Now, the conquest of Saxony, the Romans had tried to invade Germany, and they even ruled it for some decade, but up to the Elbe River. But eventually, they were defeated by Teutoburg force, and they attempted to reinvade Germany another 2 or 3 times, but they weren't convinced about it, because it was a problem of costs benefits. These were areas that were extremely difficult to civilize, at least in Roman or Frankish perspectives. The Franks kind of made it. On the reasons of why they made it, now we could spend like a 24 hours video long. Maybe for another. This is for another time. But now what we're interested in is observing, I would say, the strategical farsightedness and obstinacy, stubbornness of the Franks. That are very important things, because the Franks were fighters. They didn't give up. So the conquest of Saxony was launched. This was actually a 30 years war. It lasted really 30 years, and it was started in 772. So Charlemagne, this was aimed against the Saxons with the purpose of conquest and control all the territories essentially stretching between the Rhine and the Elbe River. Why this? Well, this is something you see better with a map, which I provided you here. The point here is the Saxons were extremely warlike people. They had always created problems to the Franks. They were essentially a looming threat over Austrasia, over Thuringia. They were quite warlike people that was firstly independent. They didn't want anyone to mess up with them. The Saxons back in the day, so I was saying before, the Franks and the Saxons were actually quite similar ethnically speaking. This is something you see especially between Austrasia and Saxony. It was a pretty close similarity, also in language, in juridical traditions, and so on. But at this point, the Saxons were this constant threat at the borders of the empire. They launched destructive raids along arguably some very important centers. Think about Cologne, think about Nijmegen. So these areas that were also increasing in importance because of the trade routes that were developing in there. At this point, there is an increasing traffic also into the North Sea that the Carolingians are kind of benefiting from. So the Saxons are this kind of continuous thorn on the side. At the same time, they were surrounded by other populations who were kind of hostile to the same Saxons, chiefly the Slavs. Saxony was also pretty close to, it's just south of the Jutland Peninsula, and at this time also the Nordic peoples were beginning to create problems to the Franks. So seizing this consistent area of Central or Northern Europe, as you prefer, between the Elbe and the Rhine and the Elbe, was definitely a very important endeavor that could secure and pacify large areas of Austrasia, and therefore making it more easily controllable and extending the empire beyond. So these lands, however, as we've seen, were quite difficult to control, to even to colonize in the first place. So the Carolingian campaigns against the Saxons were extremely violent, extremely bloody. The Carolingians really went extremely hard on the Saxons because they didn't want to be curbed. And if you look at the first campaigns, essentially the Franks went there to lose. But so you say, why conquering Saxony? Well, essentially the Carolingians managed, after enormous efforts in 30 years, so at the beginning of the 9th century, to seize control of the whole Saxony, to colonize it, to evangelize it, and to essentially make it some of the best administered land of the empire. In fact, the Ottonians into the 9th century will emerge as successors of the Carolingians, essentially being Saxon counts. So Saxon Frankish aristocracy, and starting the Renovatio Imperii from there. It's very interesting how these Germanic populations were dramatically adverse to the Frankish political and social models eventually turned out to be the ones who were the most able to absorb them and to re-elaborate them in a more centralized fashion. This goes for the Saxons, this goes for the Normans, both in England and into Sicily. And this is important to understand. This is now I would have a lot to say actually about the conquest of Saxony from a political, military, also social point of view, but we will maybe look at that on another occasion. For now, what is really important is that the Franks had the political vision, the determination, the obstinacy to carry out a 30 years war against these Saxons who didn't want to know anything about the Franks, and to transform them into Frankish subjects, and to basically seize at that point the whole Germany, so securing a base area of Central Europe and keeping it under their dominion, so that after the initial rebellions, the Saxons remained firmly under the Frankish control. And in this sense, achieving a feat that not even the Romans had been able to do. Obviously, it's difficult to be so radical as an interpretation. Obviously, the Romans had also very different priorities compared to the Franks, so it's not that, it's naive to believe the Romans couldn't conquer Germany. The point is that it was not enough convenient given what they were into. For the Franks, instead, was much more important, because Saxony was just next door to the center of the empire proper, and they need to take it out. So they had a massive strategical benefit from incorporating this land within their domains and getting rid of the Saxon threat. So it's as if, all Austrasia could breathe once again, having taken off this the Saxon pressure from their borders. So the border was shifted from the Rhine to the Elbe, and that also became, in fact, and that's why Saxony remained also quite a militarized land in many ways, as substantially the frontier with the Slavs in there would remain for centuries, and that's also partly why the Ottonians rose from as such effective political and military leaders, because they were also inhabiting this quite warlike area that also partly benefited from the older Saxon military traditions. And this had been a bit the same for the Carolingians, who came from the most militarized areas of the empire and rose to revive the empire once again. So it's interesting to see how there are these similarities between the two things. Okay, so in parallel with the conquest of Saxony, so that it was the bigger chunk of Germany that was essentially had that had remained outside the Frankish domination, the Carolingians expanded under Charlemagne also into the Danubian areas of southern Germany, and in here they managed to reincorporate finally the Duchy of Bavaria in 788. This duchy was very important because we have seen before, actually, the Bavarians weren't like these other Germanic peoples like the Franks, the Longobards, the Saxons, the Goths, the Anglo-Saxons, that more or less were an ethnic group on their own. The Bavarians were formed essentially as a collection of so many different communities that dwelled in there and to send this Danubian area of Europe, and that were formed as a duchy, not as a kingdom, chiefly seemingly on Frankish initiative. So that the Duchy of Bavaria was created back in the day more than else as a sort of political ensemble by the same Merovingians at the time, to kind of say, okay, let's give them a chief in there so that we know who we're dealing with. This was done quite frequently, actually, during the migration era, that there were maybe certain scattered tribes that were quite difficult to influence politically in bloc, let's say. So some external power, could be the Romans or other Germans, like in this case, basically backed the ascent of a certain dynasty in the area and conferred them certain titles and prerogatives, and essentially backed them to create something more centralized. And the Duchy of Bavaria, however, had remained a bit on its own when the Merovingians had collapsed, always fearing, however, the Franks could easily reach them once again, just sailing down the Danube. They had always sided with the Longobards, as we've seen, even though they were also basically not really incorporated into the Longobard kingdom, but becoming sort of buffer state. Theodolinda, one of probably the most famous Longobard queen, was Bavarian, actually. They were Catholic since an early time, which is something they had in common with the Franks in this sense, while the Longobards were were still Arian. But the Longobards had expanded into Bavarian territory as well, so that's why they eventually ended up, because Italy was the closest power at that point, so they kind of necessarily got into the orbit of it, but the Longobards kind of didn't harass them more than much. They just were kind of controlling the Alpine passes, of making this making this expansion into the Danubian watershed of the Alps, and that's how that's it. The Longobards were not interested in expanding into the north of the Alps more than much. Just controlling the passes was enough. So now, by seizing this territory, Charlemagne opened also another way, because eventually Bavaria was conquered along the Danube, because just past Bavaria along the Danube you find this Avar Khaganate at the time was pretty decadent, and the Carolingians managed to incorporate. And plus they began, especially when Charlemagne, as we will see, conquered Italy, to control also the Alpine passes from Bavaria into Italy was very important, also because given that the Carolingian armies made often back and forth all over Europe, it was sometimes where they were stationed into Saxony, it was much easier to go down to Germany through the Alps, let's say, from and not having to go back to the western passes of the Alps. So getting through this Bavarian land that allowed them to reach Italy quite easily. Also because even after the Carolingian conquests, the Longobards, especially in the northeast of Italy, kept rebelling. especially also seemingly in coordination with the Saxons, and therefore the land of Bavaria was essential for the crossing of the Alps for the Carolingian armies, into trying to save a lot of strategical a lot of resources to reach these two theaters more quickly. Another very important direction of expansion was the one in the southwest, into the Iberian Peninsula. Now, as we all know, the Franks had halted into the first half of the 8th century an Arab invasion of Aquitaine that threatened to invade also other areas of the Carolingian Empire, and this invasion had been partly repelled. I say partly because even this great victory of Poitiers didn't halt at all the Arab expansion. On the contrary, a few years after, the Arabs swarmed into southern France. This was a pretty serious situation. So if you look at the orography of Europe in there, you basically have the Atlantic Sea in the west, and you have the Pyrenees and the Mediterranean. So the passage from which the Muslims swarmed into Gaul was actually these pretty narrow passages in the northeast of Spain into Catalonia, along the coast. So basically seizing the Pyrenees was a quite important feat to ensure that these raids could be contained into Catalonia and not to swarm into Gaul. So this was all for the sake of protecting essentially trade, the local agricultural resources, because naturally the Arab invasions were aimed, as most of the invasions at the time, naturally they had several different strategical reasons, but they entailed every time by standard a lot of devastations, pillaging, and stuff like that. So that was detrimental for also the production of many, the local economy essentially. And mind that at this time economical potential was very, very low. So if you raided one, you could make enormous, you could cause enormous damage for generations to come just in a single campaign by raiding and destroying, farms, other agricultural centers, and that was definitely a very unnecessary loss that had to be prevented in some way. So the Carolingian invasions of the Iberian Peninsula brought to the establishment of this Catalonian mark that eventually remained into the marches were normally frontier areas that were highly militarized, so there was always warfare in this area, but it at least prevented, at least for some time, the Muslim incursions into Gaul to be stopped. This was also pretty tough terrain to fight in, and the Franks suffered on the pass of Roncesvalles in 778 a serious defeat that basically saw the annihilation of the rear guard of the Frankish army. So this famous the rout of Roncesvalles is extremely famous in European culture, as it basically on the base of its remembrance it was spread all over Europe. The story of Roland, that was the prefect of the Mark of Brittany, that was killed into this battle, and that these were sung famously in the Chanson de Roland. That is one of the most important works of chivalric epics in all times, indeed. And this also spread the idea that at this point the Carolingians were fighting against the enemies of the faith, also because the same Carolingians now were putting a big deal of ideological and propagandistic emphasis to their military actions. They were extremely fascinated with the Old Testament and the idea that God was on the Carolingian side during the battles and guided them to glory, to victory, etc. But actually, at the Battle of Roncesvalles, the enemies of the Franks were not Muslims, or at least perhaps certain Islamic garrisons participated to the battle against the Franks, but the Frankish rearguard was annihilated by the Basque mountaineers. They weren't definitely very happy of the Franks coming to intervene into their affairs. And you know that the Iberian Peninsula at this time, despite of the Arab invasion, was also pretty, there were very opportunistic policies as well, so that the various lordships were pretty much intermingled with the matters of the Islamic rules, and there was a lot of cooperation, etc. So this Carolingian invasion was halted. Well, it was not halted, but it suffered this setback at the hands of the local population of the mountains that had remained historically also pretty much isolated from the rest of the surrounding territories, historically speaking. It's one of the rare defeats of the Carolingians, by the way, so otherwise were pretty much victorious. So coming back to Longobard Italy, and to see how the conquest of the peninsula, or part of the peninsula, however, half of it practically happened. The Franks basically intervened once again into Italy after having been called once again by the papacy. At this time, just to prove the fact that the Franks were not natural enemies with the Longobards, Charlemagne had just married a Longobard princess, and he was forced to repudiate. I don't know how you say that in English. To repudiate, yes, was correct. And eventually invade Italy, which was something very, very bad, because in Germanic law, repudiating a bride for no reason was considered like a very great offense, and at this point the Franks were doing it exclusively for getting legitimized as overlords of this very wide area of Western Europe by the papacy. The Franks also had a very particular way they dealt with the Longobard kingdom, because they didn't abolish it. Like in other countries, there had been kingdoms the Franks had invaded, and they had transformed into something different, like a province, etc., that without any particular importance. The Franks instead cared so much about the Longobard kingdom that they maintained it, and Charlemagne seized the crown of Longobard king, in fact, and maintained, and the kingdom not only maintained its own name, but also its political and administrative structures that were extremely advanced, especially for Frankish standards. And the Franks were quite mindful about their Italian dominions. They wanted to keep them functional. They drew a lot from them in terms, in fact, of political administrative models, but also of personnel, of people, and the Carolingians sent into Italy some of the very best of their aristocracy to settle in there. Most of the Franks that settled into Italy as counts were coming from Picardy, from the northeastern of France, so those areas were the very core of the Frankish domain, so the very big aristocracy, because they wanted to trust essentially the people they were putting into Italy. And if you look at the laws that the Franks emanated into the Longobard kingdom, they were substantially asking the local communities how they were used to be governed, because they wanted to know, they wanted to maintain it in shape, and all they were extremely mindful about was maintaining trade working, because Italy was at this time rising importantly. However, the Frankish presence, this is the other point, that the Franks didn't really, as always, didn't bring to a colonization of Italy proper. They didn't send Frankish communities living in there. They mostly sent these counts, obviously with their military retinues and all, but they tried more than else to cooperate with the local elites, because they knew that they didn't want to upset them, because these were relatively powerful and they could create problems, and especially Italy was on the southern frontier, so it was also not extremely close to a center of power. So the Franks began essentially to carry out a policy of alliance with the ruling classes, and to try to control, the civil, military, and religious power through this cooperation with the local communities. And only when the local communities rebelled, they started behaving sneakily. Sometimes even this happened with when this was not really. The Franks sometimes used some pretext to accuse these local aristocracies of this. They could substitute them, even violently, but most of the times the Franks waited for the local dynasties of, especially the ducal dynasties. The Longobard kingdom was split into duchies substantially, so they didn't immediately go with iron fist. They kind of confirmed the rule of the local dukes and waited for them just maybe to die out as a dynasty, etc., to eventually replace them with the Frankish aristocracy. And sometimes they sent in there also other representatives that came from from populations that had been very much integrated with the Franks, like the Alemanni or the Burgundians, for instance. And the conquest of the Longobard kingdom was extremely important from an ideological point of view for Charlemagne, because it basically allowed to complete this process of legitimization that had been started by Pippin. So the Church of Rome had definitely looked extremely favorably at, as we've seen, at the Frankish intervention. This was very important because the Franks could be used by the popes to resize the importance of other bishoprics of very ancient tradition that existed into Italy, like Ravenna or Milan, that had their own local, they had their own ambitions. As we've said many times of Schwerpunkt, at this time Rome was definitely the most important religious center in the West, but there was no thing like the Roman supremacy over other episcopal seats. So now the Carolingians basically began to favor the Pope also in this competition against the other episcopal seats, so resizing a bit their own influence. And the same went for Constantinople in itself, because now siding with the Franks, Rome could say to the Byzantines, look, now have a big guy was defending me as well, so I kind of don't need you anymore, or at least I might need you, but only if you do what I say, and it's convenient to me. So this was a very important move. The Church of Rome was expanding very fast at this time, especially from the mid of the 8th century. The Church of Rome was starting to build a greater dominion into central Italy. A dominion proper. Rome had, in order to call, in order to crown Charlemagne as emperor, had asked the Franks to give them all the territories that stretched essentially from the Po Valley to the Strait of Messina, because Rome basically saw its ideally her metropolitic rule over this huge area. When the Franks read this, probably they didn't even they started laughing, because it was not possible. By the way, the Roman Pope at this time didn't have the means to control all of this area. Actually, it will never be able to reach this. During the Middle Ages, Rome, kind of the papal states evolved very slowly, and it's not before the modern age that basically reached to conquer cities like Bologna. So it was actually a very slow process, but the popes had already their mind pretty much set on this. And this idea, they had to create their own dominion within the Italian peninsula, and to essentially keep out everybody who looked too strong, essentially, and could take advantage of their of the situation to resize their power. So naturally, what a better occasion now than calling the Franks to asking them for protection, but and legitimizing them as Western emperors, but at the same time asking for these favors in return. So also from here there is this kind of ambiguity that starts in the relation between the papacy and the emperors that will last essentially for the whole Middle Ages, and that was based on this idea that the popes wanted to rule as emperors in their own lands as well. And the so Charlemagne arrived having defeated the Longobards and presenting themselves in Rome as the new Christian king, the greatest defender of the Roman Church. And this title was formalized finally in the year 800, when Pope Leo III had called essentially for had called Charles for help. And this occasion had started because Leo III had been aggressed by his opposers among the Roman aristocracy. There was a lot of agitation in Italy when the Longobard kingdom was about to collapse. There was this sense that the Franks would have arrived sooner or later. So also in Rome, all these various factions were siding either for the Longobards or for the Franks, were pretty much violent one against the other. Rome always had terribly violent aristocracies that influenced heavily also these historical events all over Europe. So Leo had gone himself to Paderborn. That was one of the many residences of the Frankish court, and he was brought back to Rome with a Carolingian escort to be reinstated in the city as bishop. So it's at this point that Charlemagne reached once again the Pope, and on Christmas of the year 800, the same Charles was crowned emperor by the hands of the same Leo III. So this event is being also, now we don't have time to go in depth with it, but it's probably one of the most important events in the history of mankind, and the meaning of this crowning has been overly debated in many ways, because especially for a strictly historical reason, because the sources state quite different things, actually, the contemporary sources. The Franks essentially were suggesting, at least the Frankish sources were suggesting, that the Charles was crowned essentially by surprise by the Pope. So this is naturally absurd. There are so many people who still believe this thing. Other sources, first of all, state the exact contrary of this. First of all, this was done in the presence of all the dignitaries, of the presence of the Roman aristocracy. It was an extremely staged event, where obviously Charlemagne not only was perfectly aware that he was about to be crowned, but he had naturally agreed this in advance himself, also because it would have been a too rich opportunity not to be exploited. What the Franks were stressing with these sources was this kind of ingenuity that was seen as a positive character of the perfect Christian ruler that didn't even expect such a great honor, and that wanted to perhaps stress how it was fully a papal initiative for this thing to have happened, because the Franks were perfectly aware that this was a kind of a quite I don't like the term revolutionary, but this is kind of might be used in the sense that nobody had ever done anything like that, and that this crowning had a great meaning that also entailed the concept of imperial dignity, that was something the Franks had been buzzing and reelaborating in their heads since the time of Clovis, and around which they had essentially built their own political and military prestige. So at this point also the relation with Constantinople are extremely important, because the Carolingians perfectly knew that a Roman emperor couldn't be created in this way, by being crowned by the Pope. Only the true Roman Empire, the Roman emperor, could recognize another emperor. And however, the Franks probably believed that their military might at that point was a proof of God's legitimization of their own imperial rule. So this is also why the papacy comes into play as a very meaningful actor in this sense, because the Carolingians were essentially keeping on stressing the prerogatives of their own ruling dynasty through any mean possible, and this is something that especially had the Merovingians had began to do back in the day, using every kind of possible help from the church, from especially this sacral, think about the holy anointing and all this stuff. So, and this perfect marriage, let's say, with the Church of Rome. So this was not just an empire, it was the Christian empire as well. All what it took, it had to be a fully Roman empire, which was kind of recognized through this, but in a way that was seen as very, I don't know even how to say that, not fictitious, but almost, I mean, as a very irregular evenience, at least, compared to what the standards had remained back in the West. Because here we're talking essentially about only 300 years after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. So it was not a world that was forgetful. The Western Roman Empire, the Western Europe perfectly know that there was a Roman Empire than there in Constantinople. Nobody had ever denied the Roman authority of the Constantinopolitan emperors. It was always clear that that was Rome and that was the empire. It's us in the modern times that we have to stress that that wasn't for some reason. At the time it was very, very clear. And there was this general embarrassment in doing such a new experiment, because the Carolingian Empire was objectively so large at this point to become a political and military equivalent of the Eastern one. And now the Carolingian Empire was expanding also in regions like Istria or up to southern Italy that were at the border with the Byzantine lands. And they were growing pretty close, so that the Byzantines now were pretty cautious about this Carolingian giant that was forming to the west, because they were saying, oh my god, what are these guys doing now? And at the same time, there was naturally an effort from the Franks to obtain a formal recognition of their imperial authority from the same Byzantines. So at this point, there's a lot of debate on what the meaning of the empire is, and we don't have time to go much in depth with this, but let's say in the year 800 there is the birth of this so-called empire. Many people say, well, there wasn't. Well, of course there wasn't as such, but the year 800 is, however, the moment in which this relation between the papacy and the Western Empire began, whichever you want to call it. There were prodromes to this, as we've seen, but this is something that changed. Many scholars stress that the empire that was born in 800 was not an empire in the sense of the meaning of the term that was used in the ancient times. And so it's as if the papal crowning recognized the new role of Charles the Great within Christian Europe that he had, so Western Christian Europe that he had unified through his imperium, objectively, so through the force, through a power that was evident, was quantifiable, and that by those time mentality had been sanctioned in this sense by God. And this is what also the Carolingians were pushing much for, the idea that their sword, their victorious sword that had managed to make them subdue half of the continent, was essentially guided by the divine will. Others, however, saw this instead as something different, that basically Charlemagne became the king of several kingdoms. Let's say it's a sort of overlord, an overruler of several other entities that were the ones into which the empire was made up by. So this is very meaningful also from a strategical point of view, because objectively after 800 the Carolingian expansion kind of ceased to happen. At this point Charles the Great mostly strengthened, spent time mostly strengthening their domains rather than conquering others. So it's as if this papal crowning had mostly been a moment of definition, of consolidation of the empire, of formal sanction, of final sanction, of holy recognition of the Carolingian achievements. There is also another perspective that is the papal one, that was essentially showing to Constantinople that now the Roman Pope had the moral authority to confer the title of Imperator to, in this case, to Charles the Great, and therefore strengthening the role of the papacy as a supreme authority of Christianity, and indirectly weakening the one of the Byzantine Empire. This was very important also for certain cultural problems, because at this point the Byzantine Empire was dealing with iconoclasm, among the other things, and it was ruled by a woman, Irene the Basilissa. Actually, she was not empress, because the emperors could be only men, but she was actually the regent of her son, whom she had killed, by the way, at one point. So just think of what kind of... so this was seen as a moment of extreme moral corruption of the Eastern Empire from the papal perspective. And the iconoclasm had been a huge problem, especially the Byzantines into their Italian domains now had really confiscated lots of goods. They had robbed a lot of stuff, so this was seen in an awful way from the Church of Rome, that instead was extremely interested in seizing those ecclesiastical properties herself. And objectively, I must say, before the Gregorian reforms, I always stick to the Western perspective, because objectively what the Byzantines did up to that point was always pretty weird. I mean, if you look at all the various heresies, the doctrinal controversies, the heterodox stands, etc., that those all came from Constantinople. And that was pretty messy. And from a Western perspective, that is normally considered as kind of illegitimate, or kind of a objectively, the Western Christianity, in all its primitiveness and ignorance, was doing a bit better from a strictly doctrinal point of view. I mean, massively better than what the Constantinople was doing. Naturally, there are many reasons. We don't have to be categorical, but this is important to make you understand that Constantinople now was increasingly perceived as a different world, and even the projection of the papal interests across the Alps in the Central Europe was a great turning point into history, that however was also backed by the fact that objectively the Carolingian Empire was a hell of an empire at that point, and could really represent the alternative to the Eastern one, or at least being recognized as the Western equivalent, aside from the strict legalism that objectively didn't make it a true let's say Roman Empire. So this last thing, especially with the problems that were occurring into the Byzantine Empire, was a very important justification, formally speaking, because it's as if the popes were saying not just these guys have the power for being Roman emperors, but you guys in the East are also unfit for this, because you have not been able, for instance, to defend me. This was also important. Basically, the Byzantines at this point had lost the direct ability of intervening into Italy and saving the papacy from the Lombard pressure. So the Pope was remarking that, saying, this is the truth. Why is this God making myself saved by these Franks and not by you, Byzantines? Because this was the real point. So this naturally also stimulated lots of political and religious theories that were now beginning to revolve around the idea of imperial dignity and authority and so on. And what is interesting is that there was a lot of mediation, a lot of negotiations between the Carolingians and the Byzantines. There was also some kind of warfare between at least certain proxy states. For instance, and the Carolingians attempted to conquer the Venetian lagoons at this time, that were seeing the rise of what would have become Venice, that was formerly a Byzantine territory now. Charlemagne's son Pippin died of malaria during the military campaigns against the Venetians. So there was warfare going on these frontiers of the empire with the Byzantines. And after a few years, I mean, a few years after the crowning of Charles, the Eastern Roman Emperor Michael I recognized in a diplomatic seat the imperial dignity of the Frankish sovereign. This is pretty funny because the Byzantines were extremely subtle about and very cautious about everything they did, rightfully. And in this document, they were recognizing essentially an unspecified imperial dignity to Charles. They were calling him Imperator, but they didn't specify of what. So they never basically called him Roman Emperor. They just said, okay, you're Emperor in the sense that you have an empire, that you have this imperium, that you have this military strength. It was recognized and couldn't be, and it was very flattering for a Carolingian, from a Carolingian perspective, to see their military might to be recognized, but it wasn't recognized as a Roman imperial dignity. And throughout all the Eastern-Western relations, it was never a recognition of the Roman imperial dignity to the Western Empire from Constantinople, ever. And this was very kind of necessary because duplicating the imperial dignity could have arisen extremely very big problems, because at that point the Western emperors might have said, okay, now we have an imperial dignity, we can even start, challenging your own on a legal basis, saying essentially, I'm an emperor and I can talk bad about you and how unfit you are to be an emperor as well. Or to claim, obviously, a imperial dignity over certain lands, or trying to set, in this sense, a more, to this setting these spheres of influence between certain territories and their to whom they pertained or not. So the Byzantines were quite clever not to recognize this ever to the Franks, and they kind of lived with that without any falling into the trap of recognizing it. Okay, so for now, I don't know what to say, because there is too much to say and I don't know how to cope with this. So the video is already pretty long the way it is. I didn't plan it to be so long, but it always happens like this. So I hope to have given you some thoughts about the, really how this empire formed. I will be talking more about the Carolingians in the future, I don't know when, but recently I was happy to give you certain ideas about this, and it's interesting because there is so much to know about this empire, because it was so big that it entailed so many different relations with so many different peoples, and looking also at the political theory, at the military organizations, is very important to understand where these guys were heading in their mind, and therefore trying to understand also this Carolingian mindset is definitely fascinating, and that has been this kind of incredible event in history, because let's be honest, during the Middle Ages there was no power ever that managed to encompass so many lands as in Europe, of course, as the Carolingians did. They lasted less basically than, as this big empire, they lasted basically 1 century. Yeah, of course they existed before. There were these successors, let's say, of the empire that eventually turned into other kingdoms, but the Carolingian parabola is extremely fascinating because it kind of changed everything, and we will have time to explain also more in detail how. Also from a cultural point of view, that is, my opinion, probably the greatest well, not probably the greatest legacy, but at least at an equal level with the political and social morals. Like, before the Carolingians, Europe was very much divided culturally speaking. There were people who wrote in different ways, who had different traditions. The Carolingians brought actually a lot to the construction of a European community, even if we can't really see it, if not on the long run, because obviously at the time the Carolingians didn't reason in that way. The concept of Europe didn't exist as we intended today. It was mostly a geographical concept, but it's objectively, a lot of similarities that exist between many European countries today, especially in the West, objectively stem from Carolingian times. If you take even the same core of the European Union back in the day, if you take these big chunks of Europe, that is Germany, France, and Italy, you get that's Carolingian Europe. In fact, there were lots of jokes after World War II when this was created, because they were asking, what is that you want to do? You want to recreate the Carolingian Empire? And it was not a coincidence, because objectively this has remained really the Carolingian legacy has lived on partly historically in these countries. Other parts of Europe had different stories. They're not less European in this sense, but that brought also the influence of other entities. If you take Britain, that had its own history in its own perspective. You take the Eastern world, the Eastern Europe, that also has a very peculiar history. So I think Carolingian Europe made its impact in a way that is very fascinating to consider under the light of these factors, and well, maybe one day we will do it. So for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.